Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School, and welcome to the Jack Provenza Legacy Sabbath School. Both groups are meeting together today in order to discuss Gary Chartier's book, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. I chose two passages from the letter of Paul to the Romans because I thought that they would be most appropriate. However, things have changed in our understanding of the letter of Paul to the Romans, and so it's not altogether clear that the passages are as apt as I once thought. But I will read them and comment briefly on them and indicate how our understanding of these passages has changed. So this is from Romans 1, where Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." Now, I'm reaching over here to Sigva Tonstad's commentary on Romans, and he has translated these verses differently in light of how the letter is now being understood differently by a number of people. That is, we have over the centuries spoken in terms of Paul saying it is our faith in God through Christ Jesus that saves us. But this other way of looking at it says, no, it's not our faith in God through Jesus, but it is the faithfulness of God to us. Just reverses that. So here is how Sigva Tonstad translates these same verses. "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel," that's the same. "It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." That's still the same. "For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faithfulness to faithfulness, or from faithfulness for faithfulness, as it is written." So far, pretty close to the same, but here, the last sentence is different. "The righteous one will live by my faithfulness," says God. "The righteous one will live by my faithfulness," instead of living by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, let me read further and comment in addition. It says here, maybe I should say something about this first. Typically, I think over the centuries, we have understood the last few verses being Paul's own words. And we have wondered how Paul could be so severe on the Gentiles when in fact, over the decades, he had been rather supportive of the Gentiles. And this seems rather condemning. Increasingly, it is thought that Romans 1, verse 18 down through the rest of the chapter are not the words of Paul. They are the words of people with whom Paul is disagreeing. And that puts this all in a very different light. Now, it compromises my reason for reading the text, but I still think it's important for us to note that this change in our understanding of things has happened. Then the idea is, according to the commentators, that in Romans 1, Paul allows those who oppose him to have their way, to have their say. But in Romans 2, he comes back and says, well, what about you? What about you? And some people call it a sting operation, in which Paul opens things up in Romans 1, but then comes back in Romans 2 and hits them pretty hard. So in Romans 1, the Gentiles are condemned for not noticing God in the natural world. But in Romans 2, they are admonished for not noticing God in their consciences, which is different. Now, I've typically said, well, it's both. Now it looks like it might be the opposers of Paul in Romans 1 and his own views in Romans 2. So here we go. "These are not the words of Paul, but those who oppose Paul, according to recent translations or recent commentaries. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Again, the thought now is that these are not the words of Paul, but they are the words of those who were condemning the Gentiles in their opposition to Paul. And then we have here in Romans 2, another passage, which I think does represent Paul's own views, but some have doubts about that as well. Paul says, all who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. And here goes Paul, I think, when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, that is, when Gentiles who do not have the Hebrew scriptures do what they require, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when Paul says, according to my gospel. When according to my gospel, not according to your gospel, but according to my gospel, God through Jesus Christ will judge the secret thoughts of all. In any case, I would want to say that those who opposed Paul, it would seem those who opposed Paul thought that we could know the moral truth by looking at the natural world. And then it seems like Paul was moving in a slightly different direction, maybe major different direction, saying it is not the natural world so much, but it is the conscience of people, that they have an innate awareness of what's right and wrong. Okay, with that in mind, I turn to Professor Chartier's book toward the end of the first section, and he says this, which I think is reminiscent of what Paul says in Romans 2. Maybe reminiscence is right, not the right word, but in any case, I see a similarity between this and what Paul wrote in Romans 2. This is what Gary says. A voluntaristic account of norms of judgment seems like a non-starter. But once reasoning in general is accepted as objective, as inherent in the way things are, and not a contingent divine creation, we might wonder why moral rightness or wrongness should be treated as any less capable of independent objectivity than logical or epistemological or mathematical or aesthetic rightness and wrongness. That's page 66, over to page 67. He writes, we unavoidably risk turning our creator into a domineering tyrant when we speak of God as, quote, the commanding will, close quote. To be sure, divine choice and intention lie behind the contingent structures of reality, and so at the root of who and how we are. And since who and how we are determine what it means for us to flourish, and since what it means for us to flourish determines what will qualify as consistent or inconsistent with love, as right or wrong, divine choice and intention ground right and wrong. Now, this last paragraph I think is really important. The moral order, like the mathematical, the logical, the epistemological, the aesthetic, is what it is because of the way things are. God couldn't create a requirement in virtue of which murder was required for the same reason, that God could not make it true that 1 + 1 = 6. God's creative work lies behind all the moral truths that hold in the world. But it does so precisely in virtue of divine creative activity's role in shaping the existence and character of the way things are. So if I understand this correctly, the point is that God creates the universe in a certain way. He might have had some discretion in that, but once the universe is created in the way that God has created, there are certain givens that whether we are Jews or Gentiles or anything else, we should be able to see as objectively required. That's a very, very important point, and one about which we should discuss very thoroughly, because it gets away from the idea that the moral life is a matter of submitting to authority. Extrinsic authority, alien authority. So we begin with prayer. As we do so, we are mindful of the recent death of a man named David Ray Griffin, who was one of the most influential process thinkers of our time. I have indicated to others that I think he was the most precisely technical of all the process thinkers. And it's a surprise to me that he would die at the young age of 83. But if one looks up his books, David Ray Griffin will find a number of them in the philosophy of religion. It's true that in his last years, he became more politically engaged in ways that not everybody found helpful. But I remember him most for his work in the area of process thought. And Gary had contact with him, and it was through Gary that I learned that Dr. Griffin had died. So we think about him in gratitude as we pray. Dear God, thank you for this day again. Thank you for this Sabbath school. Thank you for Dr. Chartier, who has thought very clearly and deeply about these matters. Help us to learn as much as we possibly can from him. And thank you for David Ray Griffin, who helped so many see things much more clearly, much more precisely, and helped us to see the loving character of God more accurately. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
If I can do so, I'd like to begin with this video that some of you have seen on Facebook. And we won't discuss the Euthyphro dilemma as such, but this perhaps will set the stage for our discussion.
Hello and welcome to Philosophy Vibe, the channel where we discuss and debate different philosophical ideas. Today we're going to be looking into a major problem within the divine command theory, and that is the Euthyphro dilemma. Interesting. Now, to give a brief summary of the divine command theory, ultimately it is the idea that morality comes from God. What is good is that which is commanded by God, and what is evil is that which God forbids. We learn about morality through the divine or the religious texts, such as the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, etc. By reading and understanding the religious texts, a moral person is the one who follows the rules of God. Understood. However, within the divine command theory, there arises a dilemma known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Originally written by Plato as a dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro, it was then studied by many religious and ethical scholars. To put it simply, the Euthyphro dilemma questions the nature of the divine command theory and leads to two fundamental points about morality coming from the divine. Point 1. Is that which is morally good, good because God commands it? Or point 2. Does God command it because it is morally good? Why is this a dilemma? Well, let's look into it. Would you agree that that which is morally good is good because God commands it? Yes, I would agree with that statement. So you would agree that God is the creator of morality. If God commands something, it is automatically morally good because God has commanded it. And if God forbids something, then it is automatically morally wrong because God has forbidden it. Morality is completely and solely down to what God wants. Yes, I agree. So here lies the problem. In this case, morality becomes completely arbitrary. There is no morality other than that which God decides. No universal moral laws. Right and wrong, good and evil is just down to how God feels. Morality is not then based on any reason or wisdom or rationality, but just on how God feels, and this could change at any moment. I see. Suppose one day God comes down from heaven and visits you. God then commands you to kill innocent people for no reason other than for his personal amusement. If you agree with the first point of the Euthyphro dilemma, you have to agree that killing innocent people is morally right, because God has commanded it. So as I said, morality becomes arbitrary, not concrete, and so not really real. Yes, I understand. Okay, so in that case, I would have to side with the second point. I would say God commands something because it is good, so morality is real and concrete, and God commands us to live in a moral way. So let's look at the problems that arise with this. If God commands something because it is good, God has not in fact decided what is good, he just knows what is good. Right, but this then implies morality is something over and above God, something not created by God and cannot even be controlled by God. Morality is in fact something God has discovered, something God is bound to. God recommends good, not because he has decided this, but because this is the right and moral way to live. I see. All of this poses a huge problem for God's omnipotence. If God did not create morality and is bound by morality, he therefore cannot change morality. God cannot command what is evil and make it good. This limits God's power and his omnipotence. Yes, I understand. Morality then does not even need God to exist. If God commands something because it is morally good, then we can take God out of the equation and what is morally good still exists and still applies to us. Right, and so this is the main problem with the second point. Ultimately, if morality is over and above God, then God is not the lawgiver, just the law discoverer. Morality is bigger than God and something God must follow. Interesting. So there we have the Euthyphro dilemma. If that which is morally good is good because God commands it, then morality is just down to the whims and fancies of God. It becomes fluid and arbitrary. And if God commands what is morally good because it is morally good, then morality becomes something over and above God, something God is bound to and cannot change, and therefore limits his omnipotence. Fascinating dilemma, and indeed a huge problem for divine command theory. Well, that's all the time we have for now. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the vibe. And what are your thoughts? Do you think there are any solutions to the Euthyphro dilemma? Let us
Okay, just a second. How do I get this off?
It's not on the screen. We can see you. We're not seeing it anymore.
Right.
Okay, I think now we're set. All right. Well, we're off the video and back to ourselves and back to Dr. Chartier's book. And I don't know that we want to move into the Euthyphro dilemma right away or even at all, but maybe we can think of that as a background consideration. I think the question we have to ask is whether it is inappropriate in some way for God to recognize the inherent rightness or wrongness of certain things. And that has directly related to what Gary has written here. Now, his chapter is entitled Love, Voluntarism, and Vocation, which means that the first portion of it has to do with the idea of voluntarism, and then the second one has to do with the idea of vocation. So we need to take them in that order. And I take it that the point of the book, or excuse me, the point of this chapter, and the first part of the chapter is to answer the question, why are some things moral and why are some things immoral? And I understand Gary to be saying that some things are moral and some things are immoral, inherently so. And even if God wanted to change that, God couldn't, because these judgments are not ones subject to discretion any more than the basic laws of mathematics are. They are as fixed and as constant and as logically required as anything else could be. Now, he talks about a number of things, and I'd like to ask Gary first if he'd like to make a comment. Then I have some questions about the first portion of chapter 3. Gary, do you want to say anything before we get going?
No, let's just get started with the chapter, and anything I want to offer, I think I can toss in as we continue.
Okay, so you use the expression theistic voluntarism. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. So theistic voluntarism is the view that the divine voluntas, or will, is really important. Right. I mean, voluntarism shows up in the history of Christian thought and the history of religious ideas more generally in several different contexts. But I'm especially interested in it here insofar as the label theistic voluntarism is used for the idea that the moral, or perhaps even more broadly, the normative, is a contingent divine creation, is a matter of divine willing, so that it could be other than it is at a pretty deep level. So that's
okay. I'm sorry, cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There you used another word I want to ask you about, the word contingent. What does it mean to say that a moral requirement is contingent?
Yeah, so I think what I mean, and again, people might use this in some other ways. We could, I think, very quickly find ourselves down a rabbit hole thinking about complexities there. But when I'm objecting to the idea that moral requirements are contingent, what I mean is that they're arbitrary, that they could be other than they are, not in virtue of the way everything else is, but just in virtue of some divine creative act.
Okay, so I'm going to keep using terms that you use. You talk about maybe some moral requirements being caused by creatio ex nihilo. What do you have in mind there?
Well, so creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. So I think a voluntarist, theistic voluntarist might hold the view then that God creates moral requirements out of nothing. This has not, I would say, been anything like the dominant Christian view. So I'm not taking when I criticize this view, I'm not taking, I think, a sort of crazy, eccentric view of in any way. I think I'm lining up with the vast majority of Christian thinkers over time. It's just that there has been a strand of Christian thought, which we might associate with people like William of Ockham, which has seemed to imply, at any rate, or sometimes actively involved, the assertion that just as on a fairly standard Christian view, God brings the natural world into existence out of nothing, so God brings norms into existence out of nothing. As I said, I think this has not been anything like a dominant Christian view, but there is a strand of Christian thinking that's embraced it, and to which I think it's important to respond here.
Okay, so I want to come back to that historical question in just a moment, but now I would like to ask you about two terms you also use. One of them is comprehensive voluntaristic theism, and the other one is hybrid voluntaristic theism. Might you comment on that distinction?
I can, though I think that starts to take us down various rabbit holes that I'm not sure we need to descend into here. What I'm getting at in talking about those distinctions in the chapter is just to say that we might imagine, on the one hand, an approach in accordance with which all, say, moral norms are ex nihilo divine creations. And on the other hand, we might imagine an approach in accordance with which some moral norms flow from the nature of reality, but others are ex nihilo divine creations. So that's what I'm getting at there.
Okay, I thought maybe right and wrong were not divine contingency, but maybe good and bad are.
Interesting. So if we think about the view, the most sophisticated divine command view I know, which is that of the philosopher Bob Adams, it would be exactly the opposite.
Okay, so I got that reversed. Yeah. Okay.
So that somehow he thinks in kind of broadly Platonic fashion, it's a fact of the matter whether something is excellent, because he thinks excellence is a matter of resemblance to God, and so whether something resembles God or not is a fact of the matter. But that there are divine commands with respect to how we might choose with respect to the excellent are in some significant way contingent. So I guess that's one sort of view I'm thinking about, though it's not the only possible hybrid view that one might have.
Right. So what's good for us? I did get that. I did get that in reverse. What's good for us is objectively so. We ought not to drink gasoline because objectively that is not good for us, and so that is not so discretionary as how we relate to that objective matter. Now, I would like to get back to the history question and ask when. Now, you've said this is not. The view you're opposing is not the dominant view in Christianity. And I'd like to ask when it did become, and you mentioned William of Ockham, and we need to talk back to that. But first I see Simona has a question or comment she would like to make. Simona?
Hello, thank you. So I have a problem a little bit with this separation, because the first point that whatever God wills is good makes God into a capricious God.
Yes.
Who changes his mind whichever way he sees fit. But shouldn't it be that all that is because of the nature of God, that all that God is good per se, therefore anything that God wills would be good, right? So there's a slight difference there. It's not that God is going to change his mind 50 times over, and each time he says, well, go and kill these people or whatever, it somehow becomes good. No, God is by definition good, and so everything that God wills will be good.
Gary, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think so. My own kind of preferred view is maybe more complicated than is ideal, but I think that if we take the sort of dipolar view of God that we find in thinkers like Keith Ward on the one hand or Charles Hartshorne on the other, and we say that there is, as it were, a kind of eternal, necessary, immutable pole of the divine nature, and a kind of temporal and in some sense contingent pole of the divine nature. I think goodness is part of that eternal pole of the divine nature. I don't think we want to take goodness away from separate it out from the divine nature any more than any other aspect of truth would be. I think I'm, at least my preferred view on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Sabbath as well right now, is a sort of Platonist view in which those aspects of goodness are aspects of the divine nature. And so I think God is necessarily good. So it's not just probably a matter of definition, so that good just means whatever God wills, but rather I would say it's a matter of necessity, that because God is necessarily good, then anything God does will, in the nature of the case, be good. So I think we're probably in largely the same terrain here.
I'd like to make sure we're all very clear about the position that Gary is opposing. And one way to make it as clear as possible would be to imagine two situations that are exactly identical. And in one situation, God says, do X. And in the other situation, God says to do exactly the opposite. And the only difference between the two situations is what God says. Now, that's what I think Gary is opposing. And I wonder when that idea started to flourish amongst some Christians, and for what reason did it? Now you say, Gary, this is not a dominant view. Well, if it's not a dominant view, why did you take it up? So it's a significant, maybe not dominant, but it's significant.
Yeah, no, of course I think it's significant. And I think it started to become significant, I would say, sometime probably in the 14th century. I'm sure that there are predecessor views, but my sense is that we have that there's a kind of worry that emerges among thinkers, I would think, especially maybe Franciscan thinkers in this period in Western Europe, about approaches that they think have the potential to constrain divine freedom. And so they think it's very important to stress divine freedom, and they worry about views that in one or another they think might constrain that freedom. And so why are they so worried about divine freedom in this context? And I would hesitate to speak with much confidence about why that becomes a really prominent theme for them. I mean, I've sometimes said in the past, but this is probably both mean and inaccurate, that it's political, right? That, the Franciscans, of course, are in conflict with the Pope, and they have some investment in propping up the idea of the all-powerful emperor, and who becomes a sort of mirror image, faintly reflected of God. I'm sure that's too simplistic by somewhat, and I'm not pressing that idea at this point. But I think it's in this period, sometime around the 14th century, that we really begin to get the idea that whatever else we say about God, we need to be safeguarding divine freedom. And so, we get to the point not that long afterward with René Descartes, in which Descartes, who's a kind of heir of this view, is actually willing to say that he thinks the laws of logic are contingent divine creations. And, so Descartes is somebody who is who works, let's say, not just in, he works in many areas of philosophy, but he's certainly interested in mathematics. And he's discovering the inner logical structure, say, of some aspects of mathematics. But what he thinks he's doing is discovering some kind of contingent arbitrary divine creation. This is a view which has particular influence in some strands of Protestantism. It certainly seems to have some resonance with at least some folks in the Reformed tradition. I think there's some argument today about whether it's actually there in Calvin himself, but you certainly find it in, I think in some other Reformed thinkers, who really do want to say, as part of their glorification of divine sovereignty, that there can't be any limits on the divine will. And so normally I think a more kind of orthodox approach among Christians would be to say, if somebody says, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? Say, for instance, the kind of standard response has been, a rock too big to be lifted by God is a nonsense expression. And so God can't make nonsense expressions real. But Descartes, make them refer to reality. But Descartes and the people in Descartes' own kind of strand of thinking have often tended to say, no, there is no such thing as a nonsense expression that God couldn't turn into reality. And I think they think they're paying metaphysical compliments to God by talking in that way. And in fact, I think they're just talking nonsense.
Okay, so why should one think that God honors the basic logical principles of the universe is somehow requiring God to submit to something alien and something superior? And
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, exactly. I thought that was the oddest thing about the philosopher in the video, because it seems to me that if you think that the only way to regard things in that way, it seems to me, is to think of these as somehow arbitrary impositions on the divine will that somehow could be different or something like that. I don't think that's plausible at all, nor do I think you have to think about them as somehow separate from God. And again, I think there are different ways to think about this, but certainly one way to think about it that eliminates the problem, not the only way, but to think about it, but certainly one way to think about it that just eliminates the problem is, as I've suggested, to see these constraints as, for instance, quote, the laws of logic, as simply aspects of the divine being, as aspects of who God is. And so that there's no question of their being sort of arbitrarily imposed on God. They necessarily are, but that doesn't mean they're sort of floating out in the cosmos, existing independently of God. Rather, if we understand God as embodying goodness and truth, these things are simply inherent constitutive aspects of who God is.
Well, as you know, I think, agreeing with what you've just said, I think that for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, there is no Euthyphro dilemma, because for Euthyphro, he was dealing with a plurality of gods,
yes,
some of which were good and some of which were not good. And for those gods which were not good, to have to submit to a righteous expectation would be for them being submissive to an alien actuality of some sort. But Christians, Jews, and Muslims all believe that there is one truly righteous God, so that there is no space, I think, for this idea that God adhering to what is logical is somehow limiting God's freedom. Why is it then that so many Christians accept the Euthyphro dilemma as though they had to take it seriously?
Well, I do really think that the strand of thinking that I would associate with people like Occam and Duns Scotus really is still quite influential even if it's not been, as I would say, I think the kind of the dominant Christian view, it's been an important Christian view because it has probably to some people seemed as if it offered a way of saying, as it were, maximally complimentary things about God. It offers the opportunity to affirm divine omnipotence in the most extravagant fashion. And I think there's even a worry that somehow it would be impious on our part if we were to question whether any particular capacity fell within the whether something I could use words to describe was a capacity God had. Because of course, if I can use words to describe it, it must be that God can do it. When in fact, we might have good reason to say that the words being employed turn out not to make any sense at all.
I read a book by a Jewish historian of ideas who thought that the doctrine of predestination in the 16th century and somewhat following that in some circles is the reason why, or at least it is a reason why, this idea of God's contingent creation of moral norms surfaced. That is, only a God who could do whatever God wants to do would do the things that the doctrine of predestination suggests God does. So it had that necessity amongst those reformers. So this Jewish writer thought. What do you think?
Well, I think that for a number of people in the Reformed tradition, and again, I think there's some argument about whether this applies to Calvin himself or not, but certainly for a number of people in the Reformed tradition, there definitely is this, predestination in all its, awfulness, and voluntarism go hand in hand. Now, I don't think it's obvious that people adopted voluntarism to make predestination defensible. I think both ideas have their roots in this desire to refuse to constrain divine freedom. We know that the idea of predestination really gets spelled out, in St. Augustine's later work, and it's there in the ideas of the monk Gottschalk in maybe the 12th century, something like that, maybe even a little earlier, and that's double predestination, the full Calvinist form, and so I think. It's not as if predestination just occurs to somebody in the 16th century. And it's got its own prehistory that obviously has to do with an attempt to affirm the sheer gratuity of grace. But I think clearly predestination and voluntarism about the good and the right go hand in hand because they both reflect this idea of sheer untrammeled will as the most important kind of attribute of God. So there's definitely something right about what this historian is getting at. I would just say, I think the idea, both voluntarism and predestination are earlier than the 16th century, and I'm not sure that voluntarism emerges just as a buttress for predestination, even though it clearly can serve as one.
Okay, so what, in terms of the practical moral life, what practical difference does it make in the life of the ordinary person whether our basic moral norms are contingent divine creations, or whether right and wrong are inherently so? Why make this issue so important?
Well, so I think it's important to recognize that first of all, I'm going to offer an account that might seem to suggest that it wasn't important, because I think it's important to make the relevant distinctions, and then I'll try to say a bit more. So, a sophisticated divine command theory, and again, I would think about the work of somebody like Robert Mary Hugh Adams here, is offered as a deep explanation of what moral requirements turn out to be at, kind of at the bottom level metaphysically. And so it's entirely compatible with any, as it were, sort of higher level theory about those, right? So, I mean, to take a simple example, it might be the case that we should all be million utilitarians and God may command million utilitarianism, right? Now, I don't, in fact, think that's right for all sorts of reasons. But I mean, a divine command view is perfectly compatible with that way of thinking about matters. It's an account of what it is for there to be a moral requirement. Nothing per se follows from embracing a divine command view about what moral requirements there happen to be, right? So, so we find in the 20th century some thinkers, Karl Barth, Knud Eller-Løgstrup, for instance, who seem to think that, there are very particular in the moment divine commands that might exhibit some patterns, but which ultimately have to be seen as entirely particular, entirely in the moment commands. Sorry, just a moment here. Okay. Okay. Sorry. So I have a slight challenge here. My phone is really misbehaving.
Do you need to attend to something?
I do. I have to, so I need to,
Okay.
I need to take a break earlier than we normally would, I think, and pick up my wife somewhere. I will be back to continue our conversation, but if we can pick up where we are right now.
Okay.
But just, yeah, give me a few minutes to deal with a minor emergency here.
Okay. So it's now, let's say it's 11:20. Let's reconvene. That's a little later than it actually is, but let's reconvene at 11:30. How about that?
I think I can do that, but I may need a slightly more time. So,
okay.
Please, I'll try to be back by then. Okay,
but maybe while you're gone, I will say why I think this is important, and that is,
okay.
I think thinking.
Go
ahead.
continue.
Thinking
Drive
of God,
carefully. We'll wait for you.
I'm sorry.
I said, drive carefully. We will wait for you.
Oh yes. Okay. So let's take a break. But I would suggest, as we leave upon our break, this thought: if we think of God's commands as arbitrarily contingent, not necessarily grounded in the nature of reality as such, we encourage each other to obey sheer authority because it is authority. And I think that that's very dangerous. We know that some of the people who died in Waco died there because they were very bright young Seventh-day Adventists who studied at Loma Linda University. But they had been taught all of their lives to make their decisions by deferring to some authority, whether it's the Bible or the church or the writings of Ellen White. So when they made decisions, they decided to make decisions according to what the authority said. And all that needed to happen was for them to become persuaded that David Koresh was the authority, and they would be as blindly obedient to David Koresh as they had been taught to be blindly obedient to the Bible, or blindly obedient to God, or blindly obedient to the writings of Ellen White, or whatever. So their fashion of thinking was not different. They just changed the authority to which they were being deferential. And we know that they went up in flames. These were very bright, young Seventh-day Adventists, smart enough to get into the professional schools at Loma Linda, and they died because they could not think a way past reasoning by appealing to authority. Another example would be the test at Yale called obedience to authority test, where It was shown the remarkable degree that people will do cruel things to other people just because they are told to do so. Now, as a matter of fact, they weren't actually doing cruel things, but they were instructed to do cruel things, and they thought they were doing cruel things, and there was some resistance on their part. But when the researchers said, you must do it, they did it. So the problem we face is not, in my view, the problem that we are too resistant to authority. The problem, in my view, is that we are altogether too submissive to authority. And we need to learn how to be more critical in our relations to authority. Okay, let's reconvene in 10 minutes. And hopefully Gary will be with us. If he's not, we'll continue on our own. So we're back from the break, and we will continue our conversation. I put into the chat these remarks. Blind obedience to authority is very dangerous. There are many presumptive authorities which we should take seriously. However, among humans, there is no absolute authority, none whatsoever. It is very important to be clear about this. So whether it's the church or the scriptures or the writings of some religious leader like Luther or Calvin or Ellen White, nothing human is absolutely flawless, and therefore nothing human should be trusted blindly. We must always be alert to what's happening. Matthew Cortman is creating quite a little interest because he is pointing out that in the Hebrew scriptures, the human capacity to argue with God is honored. The Hebrew scriptures do not prize subservience. They prize arguing with God when one is not clear that God is right. So we have to be certain that we don't give the impression that blind obedience to authority is a good thing. Now, we also have the second topic in Gary's presentation, which is about the idea of vocation, and we can get there soon. But David Vagelin has a comment to make, I think.
Yes, thank you. You know, that the video that you showed, Dave, at the beginning, on the Europro dilemma strikes me as being too dichotomized. Point 1 and 2 shouldn't be mutually exclusive. Both positions result in a kind of a straw man approach, positing a kind of false dilemma, it seems to me. Because God, I think, creates morality, nothing pre-exists before God, does not necessarily make morality arbitrary or voluntaristic. Morality, it seems to me, is a manifestation of divine will, but good is undoubtedly obvious to God, an actual part of his very being. And since God is defined, I think Gary would agree, by his goodness, anything he pronounces is either situationally good or ultimately universally good. Does that make sense?
Well, I think so. Now, the way Gary handles this, I think, is to say God could have created the universe in quite a number of different ways. Now, that's an issue about which I might have some reservations, but my understanding is his position is that God could have created the universe in a number of different ways. Having created the universe the way God has, there are some things that are inherently right or wrong. So the contingency occurs at the point of creation of the universe, not at the point of moral obligations. So maybe God could have created us such that drinking gasoline would be good, but God did not create us that way. And so it's not good, and it's not right to allow people to think that it is good. Now, my own question is whether it really is helpful to talk about God having a lot of different ways of creating the universe. I would have thought that God would have chosen the best way to create the universe, and that then the moral requirements follow from that. But there is that contingency in Gary's thought, as I understand it, earlier on. But you're absolutely right. This is a false dilemma for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, because we believe there is one good God, and that good God embodies all that is right, all that is valuable. And that's different from Euthyphro, who thought there were a number of different gods, some of which were good and some of which were bad. And those who were bad would find it alien to have to submit to something that's right or wrong. I'm right or good. So yeah, I think that transposing the Euthyphro dilemma from its polytheistic context to a monotheistic context, as is done again and again and again, simply is a conceptually mistaken move. You want to comment further on that?
You know, I would agree. I think that we're on the same page.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on this before we move over to the idea of vocation?
I want to just say something, Dave, if I can, about about your observation about the universe. I guess I'd need more reason to think, at any rate, that there is any such thing as a best of all possible worlds, right? That is, I think there are many different kinds of worlds which embody lots of different goods. And I don't think so. I think we might imagine whole classes of worlds which it might make, which would, be deficient in comparison with others. But I think certainly within a very broad class of worlds, it seems to me there's a tremendous amount of variety that might be possible. So I'm just hesitant to go along with you in using that expression, best of all possible worlds, in the first place. Even though I recognize lots of problems are solved if one can say that that's the case. But I'm hesitant.
Okay, but what I want to be sure about is, am I accurate when I say that for you, God had some discretion in what kind of universe God created, but once that has been exercised, that discretion has been exercised, the moral requirements necessarily follow from it?
I think we agree that's right. That is, I think if God is necessarily good, if God is goodness, as I think kind of orthodoxy would have said over many, many centuries, then then there's not a matter of it's being the case that somehow once creation takes a particular shape, then goodness somehow could take different forms in relation. Your rightness could take different forms in relation to that. One rather homely example that I ran across many years ago, and I'm going to blank on the name of the author right now who offered me this, but is that it's up to General Motors what kind of car to build, but having built that sort of car, the repair manual needs to take a particular form.
That's a good illustration. Yeah. And I want to say, well, God only had one kind of car God could have made. And I think that maybe that's where we see things differently. And of course, there's no way to know for sure on that.
Yeah.
I'd like to shift over to the idea of vocation as soon as we can, but Monty Butler has his hand raised. Monty, over to you.
Yeah, so on this point of God creating the universe and the connection to morality, Gary, would you say that God created a particular universe and that then laid the limits on what was moral? Or would you say that there's morality and God created the universe in line with morality?
Well, I guess
think-
go ahead.
I think Dave is making an argument that God created the universe and in doing so defined what is moral and what is not moral. It's a chicken and
Yeah, I guess the way I would want to put it, and I think Dave has accurately captured what I'm trying to say in this chapter of the book. What I want to say is, in creating the universe, creating a particular universe, bringing into being particular sorts of creatures, God necessarily determines what will be good and right in that universe, because those creatures are as God has made them. And given that God has made them in that way, then it follows that flourishing for creatures like that takes a particular form. And from that, then it seems to me to follow that there are things that it will be right for those creatures to do, things it will be wrong for them to do, ways in which they will be able to flourish and ways in which they won't, and so forth. So that's a kind of fact of the matter that follows from the way God has made them. But therefore, when we talk about God's creation of the moral order, what we mean, I think, is the instantiation of that order in this particular universe is what it is in virtue of the way God has created the, as it were, the natural facts in that universe.
Okay, maybe I can jump in here and observe that we have an engineer in our class. And my guess is that on some projects, engineers can do different things. Having done something by way of an engineering project, then it necessarily follows that that thing, whatever it is, has to be used or managed or taken care of in a particular way. So in that sense, maybe God is the master engineer. Now, what's important, I think, here is that Gary is pointing out something very important, very significant, and that is there are many good ways in which God could have created the universe. And I'm inclined to say that God chose the best way, but Gary's saying, well, there may be not just one best way. Maybe God could have created a lot of different ways. By way of an analogy, there may be a number of different ways an engineer could do something, and that they might be equally valuable, instead of thinking that there's only one way that an engineering problem could be solved. Now, McKinley can pick this up later on. For my way of thinking, though, this moves us into the question of vocation, because one of Gary's objections to the idea of vocation is that it seems to presuppose that there is only one good way to fulfill God's calling in one's life. But there may be a number of different ways in which one's life might fulfill its calling. Now, as I've indicated on Facebook, this part of the chapter has been more challenging for me. And so it's partly because I have not read anything about it before. So I'm sort of struggling here. And I want to ask this question of Gary, and not to be understood as being sassy or sarcastic or anything of the sort. I genuinely wonder this: if your section on vocation is the answer, what is the question?
Okay, so let's try and think about this this way. So the term vocation in a lot of contemporary sort of English language usage seems to have to do with employment. People use the word vocation to talk about particular work choices. We think about a high school offering vocational education, with the idea being that it's offering classwork in a particular area that's designed to help students move toward employment in a particular area immediately upon graduation. But if we think about the idea of vocation historically, right, we've got a different kind of meaning here, and here the idea is an idea of divine calling, and so. As we know, one really remarkable shift that happens in Christian history comes, I think, with Luther's emphasis on the idea that we should think of any kind of ordinary employment as an instance of divine calling. Luther's reacting to the idea that, priests and monks get divine calls, but, everybody else doesn't. And there's a sort of hierarchy of valuation in medieval Christianity that says that there are some occupations that are ranked in the hierarchy better than others, with certainly with monastic, roles and priesthood at the top. And so Luther finds himself talking about a much more expansive conception of vocation, and I think that's important, and one that we certainly ought to take very seriously, because Luther does something important there, which is that he invites us to see a good life as possible in kind of throughout society, rather than in just these narrowly defined religious spaces. So far, so good. The idea of vocation, more broadly, I think, if we understand it in the way that a number of sophisticated Christian thinkers in the 20th century have done, vocation, is sometimes seen not, with reference to, a calling to work in a particular way, but a calling to have a particular kind of life. And whether we're thinking here about, the work of, just a range of people. Again, I think about Bob Adams, about Keith Ward, about Germaine Grisey, for all of whom the idea of vocation kind of plays the role of sort of individualizing the good. So the idea is that a person is given a unique set of opportunities and tasks that are uniquely suited, perhaps to that person, that uniquely define who that person is, and so. I think this is the most sort of sophisticated and interesting notion of vocation, not one that has to do just with employment, but has to do with the shape of one's life. And so I think this has been a very fruitful idea in some ways, and it's not one that I want to treat at all dismissively. But I think that if we don't embrace, as I think for reasons I try to suggest in this chapter, we shouldn't embrace a kind of theistic voluntarism, then the difficulty is to understand whether there's a way to make sense of talk about vocation, right? So if we think about a vocation in this way, so if you think about the approach to to love that I articulate earlier in the book, suggesting that the golden rule and the Pauline principle, and then ideas that I talk about as commitment and recognition and efficiency are all the constraints on what it means to love in the world. But we can certainly recognize that when we adhere to the golden rule and the Pauline principle especially, but also when we honor commitments, when we act efficiently, when we choose in pursuit of real goods, nonetheless, there may be, and I think usually will be, a pretty broad range of options left over for us to consider, among which we can reasonably choose. And so the idea of vocation suggests that that wouldn't be the case, suggests that there is some kind of distinctive path that's ours, that we'll be we'll be acting wrongly if we miss out on. And so what I'm interested in here is is pointing out that if we take roughly the view of love that I suggest earlier in the book, then we can't really embrace that idea of vocation, an idea in which there's, in accordance with which there's just one path for someone to take. Rather, there will be all the paths consistent with these ways of loving in the world, taken as a whole. But I want to suggest that doesn't mean that there isn't a way in which thinking about love in this way can't capture some of what's important about the idea of vocation. And I think I suggest especially with the idea of commitment as really providing that kind of structure, and seeing commitments as responses to the distinctive ways in which we've been created and the ways in which we've been gifted by God and so forth. If we make commitments in light of that, those can be identity defining and offer many of the same goods that I think vocations might be thought to be. The difference is that we can't sort of spend our time, we won't be expected to spend our time nervously worrying about whether we've missed out on getting the right vocation, whether we've, to use the example that the evangelical scholar Gary Friesen used in a book about this topic many years ago, hit the bullseye. And, the person who worries, do I have a call to the ministry? And, am I required to be a minister, or am I making a mistake if I choose ministry? Am I supposed to, take a particular path here in employment or with regard to some other major life choice? And what I want to suggest is that if we choose in accordance with the golden rule, we choose in accordance with the Pauline principle, we choose in accordance with the principles of commitment and recognition and efficiency, then we're choosing reasonably. And I think we don't need to see ourselves as acting in a way that we need to regard as problematic. And so I think we can avoid some of the guilty worries that I think sometimes are associated with vocational talk, and yet at the same time we can find the focus and identity constitution that vocations can offer, I think, in choices, and particularly in commitments, rightly understood. So that's maybe longer than we needed, but that's broadly speaking what I'm trying to do here.
Well, what I hear in the end you saying is that the idea of vocation can make people unduly anxious, nervous, spiritually uncomfortable if they're not convinced that they hit the bullseye, as you put it, hit the bullseye to having done the right thing in life, having married the one right person, having had the particular number of children, and so forth and so on. So if one believes that there's only one way to do any of these things, only one way to fulfill God's calling for one's life, that could create a lot of tension. But if someone said to Gary Chartier, I think God has called you to be an opera singer, I think Gary Chartier might say, I don't feel that calling from God. And that maybe God has called me to be a professor. not an opera singer. Now, God hasn't called you, I would think, to be a professor at La Sierra University in the School of Business with the position of associate director and distinguished professor of law and business ethics. But it might be that God has called you to be an academic of some sort in some situation because of your gifts. And so maybe, let me back up and put it this way. I think there are two kinds of divine commands, one which constitute the rightness or wrongness of something, but the other command informs us as to what is right or what wrong is wrong. Might we have a similar distinction amongst vocations? If one thinks of a vocation as contingently, arbitrarily chosen in a very pinpointed way, no. But if we think that God's calling to us means that we become clearer about the range of options we have and the range of options we don't have. It's like my dad wants to say, is there one person to marry? No, but there probably is one type of person to marry. Now, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that brings, I think that comes to that, I'm not very far from that position. I mean, I don't have a burden probably to to argue with or to contest that position particularly. And so if we imagine divine providence, divine inspiration, clarifying my understanding with regard to my gifts and opportunities and circumstances, as well as with regard to, if we think about things the way I've done in the book, kind of what it means to love in the world and what the constraints are as a result on my choices. If we want to talk about that action of divine providence, divine inspiration as vocation, I'm okay with that. I guess I would just say that's not the notion of vocation to which I'm objecting.
Any more than you're objecting to divine commands which are informative rather than constitutive.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, if divine providence or divine inspiration helps me to see more clearly that marital fidelity is a good thing when I didn't realize that, that's fine. I'm delighted to be helped to be clear about something important, of course. So I don't think we're disagreeing there.
But I want to make sure I understand this. I think most divine command theories are what I would call constitutive ones.
Yeah.
And is it the case that most theories of vocation are equivalent to constitutive, not equivalent, but parallel to constitutive divine commands in that kind of particularity and contingency?
Well, yes, in their particularity. I think it's a complicated question whether theories of vocation are also theories of contingent obligation, right? That is to say, I do think that there are accounts of vocation that seek to maintain something like this, that what's right and what's wrong really does flow from the circumstances of our created reality. And so there's not a matter. So while some ideas of vocation involve, I think, arbitrary contingent, impositions, some ideas of vocation are ones that really do see vocations as flowing from our particular circumstances, but in a way that is not any kind of arbitrary imposition on those. But I think those views have, as it seems to me, the difficult characteristic of supposing that our, kind of circumstances, gifts, etc., really do just yield one right choice, one right life path, and so forth. And I'm just not convinced that that's right. That doesn't seem accurate to me.
Okay, let me push you just a little bit further. One of your students comes and says, Dean Chartier, I believe that God has called me to become a Christian business person. That's what I think God's calling is for me. And you respond by saying,
So let's talk about your gifts. You have a real passion, let us say, for certain aspects of business. That's apparent, and also it seems to me real strengths in these areas. So it's not just that you find these areas appealing, but also that you have demonstrated the ability to do well in them. So if you want to talk about that in terms of divine calling, if what you're saying is that God is providentially, inspiringly alerting you to your gifts and your capacities and the distinctive opportunities that you have, then I want to say, yeah, I think those are gifts from God, and you can certainly use those as a Christian business person. Suppose something happens, and any number of things might, in virtue of which at some later point in your life, you conclude that instead of business, you have, there's a different direction that you want to take, provided when you do that, you take proper account of your gifts, your circumstances, your commitments, and so forth. I'm not going to come back and say, but we decided earlier that God was calling you to be a business person. That's my main concern, that I don't want, if we can certainly see the features of that person's existence and situation that she draws on in order to make that decision to be a business person as elements of what we can talk about as a divine call, because they're both they're created by God and they're brought to her attention by God. That's fine. I have no objection to that, as long as we recognize that her hands aren't tied, and it might be the case that her gifts and opportunities also leave open, some alternative possibilities.
Okay, now I want to mention one other thing, and then we need to turn it over more broadly to questions and comments. And that is, I hear you saying that one of the problems with a tight doctrine of vocation is that it causes people to be anxious about whether they've done the right thing. Okay. I would add to that, though, that it sometimes happens that one group of people will say to a particular person, it is our view that God has called you to do X. And that's another way I think the idea of vocation can be abused. And I think I've seen that happen, where some committee says, we believe God has called you to do this, and that committee's decision is wholly uninformed by that person's capacities, that person's gifts, and more importantly, that person's needs at that time in his or her life. So a person in the time when he or she should be looking for a spouse is sent off to some far place where there's no possibility of having a spousal relationship develop. And I think that is an abusive use of the notion of calling. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think abusive is the right word for that kind of stance on the part of an institution. And I think institutions need to be aware of their own temptations when it comes to matters like this. And the temptation, I think, to take advantage of people's vulnerability and of their susceptibility to influence of a certain kind. I think I'm not a fan of the way in which things work for people who are either kind of ordinary Catholic priests or members of Catholic religious orders. I think that I think priestly celibacy in particular is a very problematic idea for many people. There may be an interesting subset of people for whom that's not the case. But the idea that that's the standard expectation for people who want to serve God in full-time ministry, I think is deeply problematic and so forth. But what I want to say is that in the priesthood, and especially in the religious orders like the Jesuits and Dominicans, there is, I think, a real awareness of this kind of risk, insofar as there is a tremendous amount of time and effort put into the question of discernment. It's not supposed at all that it's automatically obvious, either to the institution or to the individual, that there is what the participants take to be a vocation of one sort or another. Rather, there has to be a long process of of prayer, of conversation, of self-reflection before that's sorted out. And I think that's very, very different from the kind of approach you've talked about, in which an institution just kind of haphazardly says, well, you have a vocation to go do X. I think institutions need to be very careful about avoiding that, and need to be aware of their own temptations to take advantage of people. And so I commend those institutions that, when they do seek to discern vocations, do so in a way that's very careful and very guarded.
Okay, Monty, do you have anybody lined up to comment or question?
Yes, I do. So let me just remind people, one question at a time. You might have a preliminary comment or a clarification question, but one question at a time per turn. Let me know if you have a second question. I'll put you back in line. We'll do gender balance, and we'll aim for that, and also priority towards first questions. So I've got Simona first. I see that Anastasia is up, and so is Peter. So we'll go initially with Simona, Peter, and then Anastasia. Simona, you're on.
Thank you. So this idea of vocation is kind of smacks a little bit of predestination. In a way, there is this one given way you can live your life if you want to live according to what is given to you. And I think it goes really against the very idea of freedom. And I think when you look at the way how Jesus speaks about things, he talks about opportunities, he talks about talents, he says this person was given 10 talents or 5 talents, and how they used it, right? Didn't say, well, they were given 10 talents and they were supposed to do X, Y, Z. They were just supposed to use them. And I think that that's an important thing, that, we have the opportunity, and that is kind of mixed with the ability and the readiness. These are 3 elements that are required for something to happen. So you need to have an opportunity. You can have all the abilities you want if you don't have the opportunity, and then you have to be ready to step into it, right? And it's not fixed. It's something that changes, throughout the lifetime, because we have different roles that we play in our lives in different ways. So in some situations, there are people who are uniquely qualified for certain positions. They're uniquely qualified to perform certain type of work. And that may be true, but they still need to be ready to do it. Would you comment on that?
Yes, Simona, thank you for what seems to me to be a very wise set of observations, with which I think I largely agree wholeheartedly. It seems to me that the idea of freedom is compromised by what I think is at least a sort of common version of the idea of vocation, and that's certainly a reason that I find myself pushing back against it with in this chapter. So and I think you're absolutely right that even if someone might in a particular case have the in the abstract, a certain set of gifts that would seem very appropriate, it doesn't follow that necessarily the person is in all respects, ready for a particular role and so forth. And even if the person is, it doesn't follow that, that person, will be making a mistake by not taking up that role. I think that certainly the way I think about it is that the various ways of loving, the specifications of love, as I call them in the book, leave a variety of options on the table most of the time, right? I mean, we can imagine particular cases where that's not true, and where the options that a person choosing well has in front of that person may be very limited, but I think most of the time that's not right. And so I think you're right that we need to be very much aware of the both the different gifts, the different opportunities, the different dispositions, and so forth that we and others bring to the table. I devoted this section of the chapter to a discussion of vocation and to challenging, I think, traditional ways of talking about vocation, not because I don't, agree thoroughly with what you said here, Simona, but because I guess two things. First of all, I do think that the way in which people do often talk vocationally is troubling, and we need to be aware of that and respond to that. But also because I think the idea of vocation captures something that people often find valuable, right? They do want a sense of something that confers order and kind of structure on their lives and gives their identities a sense of greater cohesion. And so, yes, sorry.
Purpose, the
Yes.
sense of purpose.
Yeah, and so I wanted to try to talk about how that those good things might be fostered by the sort of approach that I was trying to defend here, even without embracing the, as it seems to me, problematic aspects that are, as you very rightly suggest, kind of freedom inhibiting and so forth. So I was trying to walk a fine line here to on the one hand, being very critical of what I think are the difficult, even pathological ways in which the idea is often cashed out, while on the other hand, showing how the alternative I articulate maybe can capture at least some of the things that people find valuable there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter, you're up.
Thank you again, Gary, for your presentation. I believe that an example of contingency we had with Gary's situation, that he has to leave us for a few minutes and Dave to take over. A good contingency.
That's certainly contingency planning. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment first in regard to Josephus' dilemma, that something is moral because God says it's moral, or because it's intrinsically moral. But what about if God is commanding you to kill somebody? That is a dilemma. And yet we have in the Bible a very important example when God commanded Abraham to kill his son, to bring it as a sacrifice. And God praised Abraham because he obeyed and told him that all the nations will be blessed in his seed. Then it's a clear example of obedience and a great blessing for all nations. And yet, bringing in discussion also Dave's comment that blind obedience is wrong. Well, in this situation, Abraham show that blind obedience through faith and did what God commanded him to do. And also we have examples of obedience when Jesus told us that you are my friends if you do what I commanded you. Then we have examples of God's giving a command, an order, and taking it as it is at face value, and then doing what he commanded us to do. Also, I might add that in the beginning, there was not necessarily a moral law. When our first parents were created, God didn't give them a moral set of commandments to follow. It was just obedience. And also when God made an understanding with Abraham, a covenant, also he didn't give him a set of moral laws to follow. It was just obedience. Because you obeyed, God will bless. Then we have to take in consideration these examples. Of course, we might make a difference between Christian ethics, that is directly dependent, of course, on God, and the non-Christian ethics. And of course, you might make a comment, how can we make the difference between the Christian ethics and non-Christian ethics? That it's not dependent on God. And I might add that we are very lucky that we're created by a benevolent, a good, intrinsic good God. Because if we would have been created and lived in an universe that, as the Greeks and Romans believe, that they were living in an universe created by capricious gods, we'll be very much in trouble. And again, I want to emphasize this idea that God, as was described by Jesus, the only God, good God that exists is God himself. And he can give only good things. Because he said, well, if you are bad, are evil, you do bad things. Well, God that is good in himself will give you only good things.
Peter, do you have a question for Gary? Good comments.
Well, the question was that if Gary can make a differentiated, explain us what will be the difference between a Christian ethics and non-Christian ethics, talking about rules and regulations, not only on the fact that, of course, Christian ethics it's based on connection with God, what God requires, and non-Christian ethics is talking about moral rules, but not related to God.
Thank you.
So Christian ethics and non-Christian ethics. So I guess I appreciate the approach that Dave took in beginning our conversation with the focus that he placed on Romans 1 and 2. I think that these passages highlight for us the degree to which we might reasonably understand God the Creator as discernible in and through the creation, and the goodness of God is discernible in and through the creation. I think the way we think about moral questions, of course, in our culture today has been shaped by a long tradition of moral discourse in which Christians have played vital roles for, the last 2,000 years. And it would be naive, I think, to suppose that we consult the moral law within our breast as, to think in the terms that St. Paul seems to be suggesting in Romans 2, in a way that's uninfluenced by the immersion that we've had, that our culture has had in Christian concepts and Christian convictions and so forth. And so obviously there's been a tremendous amount of debate within Christian circles about moral questions. And yet, also at the same time, there does seem to have been a real impact that Christianity has had on our culture, as regards issues like regard for vulnerability, a refusal to treat strength and power as the most important human characteristics, the awareness that victims can be undeserving victims, right? So, I mean, we're in a culture in which, at some point in the past, it will have seemed much more obvious that victims got what they deserved. And because Christianity, of course, is rooted in an experience of utterly undeserved victimhood, the crucifixion of Jesus, this has had this has sent shockwaves through our culture in ancient Rome and the ancient Mediterranean, and in the subsequent centuries. We've experienced, I think, very much a shift, which is also influenced by ancient Israel, since ancient Israel is a society that thinks of itself as a society rooted in the escape of slaves. And so again, the people on the downside of history are not taken to be deserving of that, as I think they are in some other cultural environments. So what I guess I'm trying to get at is that, on the one hand, we should believe, it seems to me, that if what's right, what's good is rooted in the way things are and the way God has created things, then it will be the case that we can reasonably expect that reflection on flourishing should lead people should enable people to discern right and wrong. And they may not do so with anything like a full awareness of the deep rootage of reality in God's creative activity. On the other hand, however, Christianity has played a vital role in shifting moral perspectives in our culture. And when we think about moral debate in that culture, it takes place unavoidably in a way that's constrained by what the culture is inherited from Christianity. So what I think is interesting right now is we witness kind of increasing pluralization and secularization of the culture, is whether those deep insights that Christianity has bequeathed the culture over a very long period will continue to be affirmed, whether they'll continue to serve as lenses through which we are able to help make sense of what we learn through reflection on creation. Thinking about victims' perspectives, about the fact that those on the underside of history don't always deserve it. These things that we gained from Christianity, will they be lost if the culture increasingly secularizes? I hope not, but I wonder. So up until fairly recently, I think it would have been hard to draw clear distinctions between Christian and non-Christian ethics in the culture because of the impact of Christianity on the culture, and because everyone, it seems to me, is trying to discern the good and the right through attention to the created order that we all participate in. But I do suspect that now we're at a stage at which some important distinctions are being made. And I would say what we see most troublingly is the degree to which a kind of utilitarian view that sees whatever the goals of those who are most persuasive or those who are in power want to pursue as the goals that our success in achieving which is the measure of the rightness or wrongness of our actions. That view, I think, is becoming increasingly popular. There's increasing impatience with any attempt to constrain our pursuit of whatever someone regards as a worthwhile goal. And that, I think, is a feature of the contemporary moral scene that makes it very different from what I think is at the heart of Christian ethics. I've spoken too long already, but that's
Well,
at least.
thank you. Yes, very good. What about Abraham's obedience?
So Monty graciously suggested we wanted to stick with a question per person, and we're running out of time. So can I take this question? Or actually, Anastasia, I guess, has a question as well. So I don't want to.
Yes, and I mean, one thing I would add to that discussion is I think Matthew has an interesting discussion of that Bible story in his book. So that's one place to explore that. So I've got Anastasia and then Simona, but maybe we'll have time to come back to Peter if we don't have another person. So Anastasia.
First of all, I want to thank so much Dr. Chartier. We have been reading your book, and I'm sending also to my two sons. And oh, it's so much, but I will try to be, it has been very inspirational. And I love also about it's practical, because the flourishing and the two basic, if not commands, intentions of God, his love, his ecstatic love, as Papa Nicolaou says, because of his creation, and loving in the Orthodox sense, the communion with God cannot be without the communion of people. And I see a lot of that, a lot and more in your book. I promise I will ask. I put the question in. The common good, it's something that Christianity and ancients, Plato, Aristotle, etc., should have and at times had in common. What I saw lately, I will talk about the institutional thing and then the Old Testament. Unfortunately, we have not learned from the bad, I think the bad examples of so-called Christian institutions, and maybe they have the good, the beautiful, and all this, but they had terrible things. There was a psychologist today saying, give me that old-time racism. And unfortunately, as people and as institutions have blended the two throughout the history. Lately, I saw the video, unfortunately, it was for Seventh-day Adventist, David sent it, about the Seventh-day Adventist, I don't know what it was about. It was a conference or something with lots of American flags and I love America, and I think patriotism has its place. It gave me the worst nightmares about misogyny, everything, hatred rather than love. I thought I was in Nazi Germany or occupied Greece, where nationalism had become Nazism. If that's what our Old Testament inspires, God forbid, and God has mercy. And let's not forget the same God, Christ, I believe, and then I will ask you, I don't know if you saw that, about the institutional prejudices and evil that they carry when we, the people, allow them and don't speak up. And in the Old Testament, for me and my children, the story of Abraham depends how it's told, but I believe Jesus came to show the right way. God doesn't try to trick us, as my grandchildren would say. God tried to trick Abraham or order us to do genocide. I thank for your book, and there is so much more discussion of that, of what's the good and the beautiful and the practical and the moral, which should not be a part of what Jesus said. And it's not on what you wrote. It's very enlightening. And I thank you for that. But let's remember, the Bible was not dictated, was inspired. And when these people, the chauvinists that wrote it, and we go by their letter, and we do what we do today to women, children, etc., should not be honored. They should be honored for their good things about their ignorance, but not putting God's mouth in it. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simona. I'll just say very quickly.
No. Anastasia.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Anastasia. I really apologize.
Thank you. Thank you.
We know each other, and
Yes, and I respect you so very much, both a scholar and person.
You're very kind. In any case, Anastasia, I think what I want to emphasize is that nationalism strikes me as profoundly idolatrous, and not only that, stupid. And when we find that sort of attitude embraced by people, it's destructive. There's a lot more to say, and I've actually written a whole book about these matters, a book called Christianity and the Nation State, which is coming out next year. So perhaps we can talk about that. But I want to leave room maybe to just grab Simona's question before I go. I have to go very quickly, but
okay. So thank you. I'm just going to follow on this, what Anastasia said. I think that what is good cannot be separated from what is loving.
Yes.
If what we claim is good is not loving, it's not good. I mean, it's just such a simple thing. This week, I have been so burdened with what happened in Colorado Springs. And I think many of us were, that people were shot dead because they were gay. And some of the comments that I have seen from people who claim Christianity very loudly, disturbed me very much. People who were claiming that these people are going to eternal damnation because they were gay, that people who were, the father of the murderer who said that he is happy that he is a murderer, but, would have been unhappy if he were gay. I mean, things like that. There are certain things where people who claim to be Christians have to be really careful what they say and how they say it. And therefore, my personal belief is that morality is personal. It shouldn't be legislated. That, it indicates what I as a human being should be doing. And in that respect, that if I'm doing something and that something is not loving, then it's not right either.
So I just want to say that basic point is absolutely, I just agree 100%. What I'm trying to do, of course, in this book is to think about what it is to be loving, but I agree with you 100% that if you can't spell something out in terms of love, then then I think it's not right. Yeah, that seems right to me. I do need to go pretty sharply at 12:30 because of some out-of-town guests or out-of-town visitors. But I want to thank everybody once again for engaging so thoughtfully and carefully with what I've had to say in the book. And I'm glad that we'll have further opportunities to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Gary. And we will continue this next week. So we will be into the next chapter 4 next week, but we will let you go. I have one thing from the chat that I would like to bring up and put on the recording. So I'm not going to stop quite yet. And let me see if I can pick it up. This one is from McKinley. And I think this comment should be put into the discussion. McKinley says, here's a belated comment. I think what people are attempting to navigate is what in mathematics and physics are called boundary conditions, and we engineers refer to as design constraints. In the Creator's case, the constraint would be his righteous character. This righteousness constraint does not limit God's omnipotence, but perhaps allows optimal creation and creatures to flourish by choices they make, consistent with or not consistent with God's standards. The characters in the Euthyphro dilemma miss this. Simona and David Vagelin, observed the righteousness constraint. Now, I'm going to ask if McKinley wants to say anything more about this now before we turn to the digital potluck, because I think what McKinley has said here is very, very important. After he comments, we'll have the benediction and then move to the digital potluck for those who stay by. McKinley.
Thank you, Dave. I don't have much more to add to what I wrote in the chat, except to say that we Christians, I think, do very well to remember that our God is not capricious, and all of his actions are governed by his character. And, to the extent that God's character also inform his omnipotence and his sovereignty, those two attributes of God are also not compromised.
Okay. I think that's very important to have in our discussion. One announcement here, or one comment, and that is the Doctors Alexander gave me this book called The Mystical as Political, and I'm going to read it. I mentioned this because December 31 is when we will have our annual book fest. So prepare to share with each other books you have read, books you want to read, books you might read, and books you hope never to read. Let's get all of these books so we can talk about them. December 31, all right? December 31. So start, if you haven't read much, this is the time to start reading so you can make a report on December 31. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.